Hello and welcome to Fueling the Transition, the podcast series from AFRY Management Consulting, where we deal with all things to do with decarbonisation, decentralisation and digitalisation of the energy industry. My name is Matt Brown. I'm Vice President in AFRY Management Consulting, working in the energy area predominantly. And I'm conscious that within the context of the energy transition, renewable investment is something that's really, really important and really vital. So I'm very pleased to say that today I have the head of RenewableNI, and that's Steven Agnew, with us, and also a colleague, Andy Kelly, who is a senior principal in our Oxford office. RenewableNI, just to introduce, they are an association representing all aspects of the renewable electricity industry in Northern Ireland. So hello, Stephen. Pleased you could join us today.
Hi, Matt. Hi, Andy. Good to be here.
And Andy is responsible, does a number of things, but also has a focus on the Irish market and everything that's going on in both the North and the Republic of Ireland. So hi, Andy.
Hello, Matt, and hi, Stephen.
And I'll get straight into the questions, I think, and starting with you, Stephen. Feel free, of course, to say a little bit more about RenewableNI and the aims of RenewableNI. But together with that, perhaps you can tell us a little bit about how the energy transition is progressing in Northern Ireland at the moment.
Yeah, thanks, Matt, for that. So RenewableNI, we're the trade association for the renewable electricity industry in Northern Ireland. Our members would include kind of developers, planning consultants, grid consultants, kind of across the range, and including large and small scale renewables, including wind and solar, tidal and storage. So we see ourselves as the main voice of the industry in Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland actually has a good story to tell when it comes to certainly decarbonisation of the power sector. At the last 12-month rolling period, the figures had us at just short of 48% renewable electricity production. I know Ireland likes to boast that it has the largest proportion of onshore wind, but in some respects it's because ourselves in Scotland get kind of brought into a UK figure. Scotland's probably further ahead than Northern Ireland, and Northern Ireland slightly ahead of the Republic of Ireland. So, but in terms of onshore wind in particular, Northern Ireland is I'd say probably second in Europe when you look at a regional level. So very good story to tell. Our objective as RenewableNI really at the minute is focusing on the next energy strategy for Northern Ireland. So whilst we're at a good starting point, having had a policy that, as I say, that's brought us to almost half of electricity from renewables. Unfortunately, the last 2 years, we've had no new large-scale renewables connect, and that's because we've essentially had a policy vacuum. We're due to get a new energy strategy in 2021, and I've been in post just over a year now, and my focus has been, I suppose, on getting a strategy that reflects the needs of the industry.
How would you put that strategy? What's the expectation that you have for renewables in Northern Ireland?
We're seeking a target of 80%. The economy minister, who's responsible for energy policy, has said that the target won't be less than 70%. So I think our ambition is close to the ambition of government at present, and we need to get that firmed up in the strategy to come in and to make that target a reality, to make it achievable. I suppose we need three things. We need a route to market, investment in the grid, and a facilitative planning regime. And in terms of route to market, Northern Ireland is the only part of the islands of the UK and Ireland that doesn't have some form of price balancing mechanism. We had what was called the narrow, which was essentially the subsidy, and I'd say that got us to where we are now, close to 48%. But since it closed in 2017, there's been hard to bring forward projects in Northern Ireland. It's fair to say we expect to have some merchant projects connect maybe by the end of 2021, but not at the levels we would need to see to reach a 70 or 80% ambition by 2030. So the work we did with AFRY, we produced the Power of Renewables, a Route to 80 by 30 report, and it really looked at 5 options and came down in favour of either or an all UK CFD with Northern Ireland having its own pot, or Northern Ireland having a pot within the Irish RES scheme. Our unique position politically allows us to kind of explore both those options, and really, if we want to stimulate the industry again in Northern Ireland, we do need to take one of those 2 options forward. Early conversations have started on that, is my understanding, but we're still some way off having that route to market in place.
And no new big projects for the last 2 years, but Northern Ireland's obviously part of the UK. Were you not part of the CFD regime that was introduced in the UK?
So legislatively, we were included. So Northern Ireland could join the CFD. Very little needs to happen for that to happen. But the assessment was made that projects in Northern Ireland might not be competitive on an all UK basis, and therefore the costs would have been spread throughout the whole of the UK, including the Northern Ireland consumers. But the benefits might not have accrued in Northern Ireland. In other words, we might not have seen renewable projects. Through engagement with our members, and indeed it's detailed in the Power of Renewables report, whilst there may be some optimal projects in Northern Ireland that could compete, a typical project, let's say, probably wouldn't. So for that reason, the DEDI, as it was at the time, the Department for Economy as it is now, decided that Northern Ireland wouldn't engage in the CFD, and that's been the case. And so therefore, since the closure of the Narrow in 2017, there's been no state support mechanism for renewables.
Okay, understood. So, and Andy, a question to you. Stephen mentioned there the options and the fact that, given the nature of the situation Northern Ireland is in, that it has perhaps a broader range of options here than one might imagine. Maybe you could give us a bit of context on the single electricity market, which was, quite an achievement when it was first put in place. And we talk a lot about the island of Ireland in this context. Perhaps you could just give us a bit of background on what we refer to as the SEM, the single electricity market.
Yeah, certainly. So it is pretty unique in European global terms, really, as well. We have a very good, well-functioning market that operates across the island of Ireland, and that comprises 2 different jurisdictions. So the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, with different governments, different policies, different local planning, different system operators. Now, at some level, the system operators work very closely together, clearly, but all of the other policy frameworks are set by different bodies, and the market itself, though, continues to operate on a very well integrated basis. We have a single price that gets determined across the whole of the market, so across both of those regions. And that means that whatever is happening in policy terms in the Republic, as far as it affects the electricity market, it will have a knock-on impact on Northern Ireland, will have an impact on consumers in Northern Ireland and the wider industry and renewable developers. And we've really come to a situation now where, over the last couple of years, as Stephen has outlined, the lack of visible policy support for renewables in Northern Ireland has placed that in a fairly particular situation. The Republic is moving ahead smoothly with its new support scheme. The rest of the United Kingdom has been able to avail of the CFD scheme, and really across all of those areas, though it is just the industry in Northern Ireland that is currently having to operate in absence of anything.
And Andy, maybe you could just sort of highlight the main differences between the scheme in the Republic of Ireland and what's available in the UK in terms of the CFD, or let's say the future of support in the Republic.
Yeah, so the Republic has actually undergone quite a change in its support scheme recently. It has now introduced a scheme which, along with many other countries in Europe, is based on a two-way contract for difference type arrangement. So there is a payment to generators up to a fixed strike price in the event that wholesale market prices are below that level. If market prices exceed the strike price, then payments are made the other way. So in concept and in the functionality, it's the new support scheme in the Republic is operating actually in a fairly similar way to that of the CFD mechanism in the GB market. There are some fairly significant differences in design elements and determination of those strike prices, for example, is quite different. Who gets awarded these contracts is obviously a function of the individual regimes, but the overall concept is now similar, albeit what's happening there, as I say, in the south is changing the environment that renewable developers are operating in Northern Ireland, because it's affecting the wholesale market price. But those generators themselves don't have any kind of support scheme to point to.
So it'd be difficult to be an investor investing on a merchant basis in the north, while there's a support scheme that's impacting directly on the revenues that you'd be able to achieve, especially at times when it's windy everywhere, for instance.
So the merchant developers always face a risk that other policy interventions come to play, which affect the underlying wholesale price. I guess, given the nature and the unique nature of the SEM covering the two jurisdictions, that's a particular risk, because the policy interventions may well and are happening in a different jurisdiction. So there's nothing the Northern Ireland government, for example, can say to provide any confidence that the scale of policy interventions in the Republic will be minimised or removed at any certain time. So that provides that context for the fairly unique position it finds itself in.
Very good. And then I think Steven mentioned a few of the points earlier, but I'm just wondering, from your perspective, what do you think is going to be required in order to meet this 80% target that RenewableNI are keen to see in place?
Sure. So we did quite an extensive piece of work with Steven and his colleagues around this, as he said, and some of the areas outside of a support scheme that have been identified that are certainly going to need some evolution to provide the right framework and the right supportive environment for further renewable developments include evolutions in the planning regime, for example. So ensuring that planning guidelines are appropriate, are transparent, clearly understood, that the process is one which is as efficient as possible. There's certainly some work around that. The scale of the renewable build that's likely to be required to deliver 80% renewable electricity is pretty significant. So we're probably talking somewhere between 2.5 and 3 gigawatts of new renewable capacity being installed in order to meet those targets. And in the context of the Northern Irish market, or even the market in the island of Ireland, that's a pretty significant amount. And so the grid connection policies, the ability of all of those projects to securely access the transmission grid in Northern Ireland is going to be hugely important. We do expect then some form of support scheme, and that's obviously actively being looked at as part of the new energy strategy. But even alongside that, there will be projects that would like to maybe kind of take advantage of some of the direct corporate offtake or power purchase agreement arrangements that we've seen in different places. So facilitating the route to market for those corporate PPAs alongside any government-supported policy scheme will also be important.
Stephen, what then, to get into a bit more detail on it, what do you think a new support scheme should look like, could look like?
What's clear is the auction-based type system, the price balancing type system that's in operation in Great Britain and Ireland is the type of model we want to see. We're fairly relaxed if we sort of almost put our lump in with the Great Britain model or with the Irish. But what it does need to be, and what's borne out in the AFRY report, is it does need to be Northern Ireland specific. We do have some competitive disadvantages in terms of grid connection costs, levels of dispatch down, and in terms of planning timelines. So, as I mentioned before, the feeling is while some projects could compete either on an all UK or all Ireland basis, to ensure the type of deployment we need to meet a 70 or 80% target, we are going to need a Northern Ireland specific pot. So, for us, that's the primary objective. And as I say, we're relaxed almost which, whether we go follow an east-west model or a north-south model. Obviously, in terms of deliverability, the advantage of doing it with the Great Britain model is that the legislation's already in place. So that would mean it could happen more quickly. Primary legislation, which would be required, can sort of take up to 2 years before you even get into scheme design. So there's that particular advantage to the CFD model. To go all island, then you're enhancing the integrity of the single electricity market. There are downsides to having two different support schemes on the one island as part of the single market. So, in a way, it's get the ideal model, but it takes longer, or to get the less than ideal but quicker.
Yeah, and I guess in the context of no new projects, large scale for the last 2 years, having another gap, I don't know how long that would be, in reality, before you had the legislation in place. Obviously doesn't help the industry, does it?
No, exactly that. And, whilst I say we'll welcome the merchant projects that hopefully come forward and connect next year, even best case scenario, we're probably looking at the middle of the decade before we see new build out the type of levels we would expect if we have a support scheme in place. Because, in terms of, say it was CFD, you're maybe looking at the 2023 auction round. And if that's the case, then from securing contracts, it can be up to 2 years before you see connections. So could be 2024, 2025 before we see any new renewables policy take effect. And
I would say given the urgency of climate change, we don't really have that time, the luxury of that time to wait, do we? I'm just wondering, Andy, is there anything you would add on the support scheme, what it could look like, any further detail?
We were looking at this for Steven and his colleagues through a number of different lenses, assessing some of the options and really seeing how they compared across a number of different criteria. So first thing was, well, it's really important that whatever scheme is landed on, is going to be able to support further renewable build in Northern Ireland. So that's kind of fundamentally important. The reason that Northern Ireland hasn't participated in the GB CFD scheme to date is principally because all of those factors that structurally disadvantage Northern Ireland projects would have meant Northern Ireland consumers paying in order to support renewables that were being developed elsewhere. And so this idea of a just transition and kind of an equitable distribution of capacity build versus payments is also really important. those were two of the starting points of assessing the different options. And then you come into really the key questions of, well, can we get this support scheme up and running in order to support projects in the next few years, given the critical nature of having to continue to support the industry to allow for the future, rollout and so on. And given the scale and the size of the Northern Ireland market, how's that done in a cost-effective manner? So, we started to rule out some options fairly easily. Developing a brand new bespoke kind of scheme from scratch, wouldn't really be cost effective, would take too long. There are good functioning schemes in both the Republic and GB, so some form of utilising one or other, would be important. But we think in any event, whether it was within the GB or the Republic scheme, it really does need essentially a dedicated Northern Ireland pot within that. So we can see that can practically be achieved within either mechanism. I think legislatively it may be quicker to do that utilising the GB scheme, but there's a bit of a trade-off then between that and the market integrity argument of having the same support scheme in operation across the All Ireland market. And so really, I think, that's where we concluded, where the conversation concluded ought to be the areas of focus now, diving into the practicalities and the political realities of achieving one or other of those solutions, but in something that needs to be done very quickly, because there's good projects, good resource availability, excellent developers and other industry players who want to continue this transition in Northern Ireland, and really they're just crying out for something to be put in place to allow that to happen.
And Andy, we're recording this late in 2020 in November, and I think it would, it's impossible not to just touch upon it briefly. But did we think about the impact of Brexit, and given there's still uncertainty at this stage, is there anything we can say much about it in terms of the impact of the work here?
So you're right that it's impossible to ignore in any of the aspects actually of the All Ireland market. I think what we don't know is quite what the post-Brexit arrangement looks like, and clearly at this stage we don't know what flavour, if any, of any kind of deal will be formally agreed. What we do know is the All Ireland market functions, pretty well, and has been a major success operating across those two different jurisdictions for many years now. And the desire, the appetite, the expectation of all stakeholders within that is that will continue. We will clearly continue to have different governing bodies in either region within that All Ireland market, but we don't expect significant disruption in the day-to-day operations and kind of fluctuations of the market. But it will be important when it comes to the finer details of a support scheme that those design elements are alive to the fact that some outcomes of Brexit might lead to slightly different rules than others.
Very good. Thanks for that. And I think we'll move, because we could spend all day talking about Brexit probably. We'll move swiftly off that topic. And Stephen, I'd like to ask you, there's across GB and Ireland, well, in the GB, there's a lot of emphasis on offshore wind. In Ireland, we understand that people are slowly warming to the idea. Is offshore going to play much of a role in Northern Ireland?
I think it will, but I think it may be the back end of this decade, beginning of the next decade, before again we see projects connect. There was a project explored off the east coast of Northern Ireland, and it was, I think by the end, it sort of went down from 600 to around 400, 450 megawatts when kind of practicalities were explored with other industries, particularly the impact on fishing. But, we're currently just short of 1.7 gigawatts, and that project alone, as I say, would have added another 25% onto that. So the opportunity for offshore is huge. There was one other site previously explored, but there were issues about where the sea border lies, essentially. And I think the potential of having to seek consents in both jurisdictions of Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland kind of put that one to bed. But I think with the first flight wind project, the one off the east coast, it was Northern Ireland's decision not to join CFD that ended that. And I think should a similar support scheme come into place, I would hope that a project like that might be revived. We've also 200 megawatts of tidal licensed, again, almost waiting for a route to market. So there's definite significant potential there. And then when we get into things like floating, then really that could increase further. But as I say, because at the minute in terms of offshore wind, there isn't any project in Genesis that I'm aware of. I think it'll take the route to market to be secured for those projects then to start to be explored again. We've also got the issue of Crown Estate licensing for offshore, and in the last licensing round, Northern Ireland wasn't included because, one, it was felt there wasn't a demand, and two, it was felt Northern Ireland wasn't suitable for offshore. But I think the latter part can be negotiated, and as I say, the first part, hopefully at the other side of the energy strategy, we'll see the support scheme in place that we'll see offshore wind projects come forward again.
Yeah, so towards the end of the decade, 2020, more towards 2030, is when you think we may see some offshore, and I guess that is in part because of the lead times as much as anything. Now, going beyond 2030 and this 70-80% target for 2030, I'm wondering, Andy, are we going to be heading towards net zero for Northern Ireland, and how does that compare to other countries as well?
Yeah, so certainly, in common with the rest of the United Kingdom, in common with the Republic of Ireland, Northern Ireland's very keen. We've got some strong ambitions for overall decarbonisation in the wider sector and the wider environment, and delivering net zero on an economy-wide basis by 2040, 2050. The electricity sector is, as almost everywhere else, having to do much of the heavy lifting for that, and that'll continue. It's likely that we're going to need to see net negative emissions in the power sector, just because the opportunity for decarbonisation in some of the other sectors is so much more challenging. And we often look at heat and transport sectors in different European countries, but both Northern Ireland and the Republic, also have a huge challenge from the agriculture industry. Decarbonisation options in the agriculture industry, would appear to be a step more challenging again, even beyond kind of those that face the heating and the transportation sector. So, in all probability, power is going to need to move beyond net zero in itself. It's going to need to move to net negative emissions to allow an economy-wide net zero to result. And that's certainly one aspect of that is going to rely heavily on ever-increasing amounts of renewable capacity in the generation mix.
And do you see that as well, Stephen? Do you see a bigger and bigger role for renewable electricity here?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, when you look at heat and transport, electrification is expected to play a significant part of those sectors' decarbonisation. So, where it's almost as if we're not just decarbonising for our sector, but for the others as well. Analysis seems to suggest that if we're talking about net zero by 2050, then the power sector needs to be at net zero by 2040. And, those types of targets are only going to come forward. They're certainly not going to be pushed back. So at the minute, Northern Ireland is covered by UK-wide climate legislation, but there is a possible private members bill looking at Northern Ireland net zero 2045, which I imagine would be incredibly challenging. But again, if that's the case, it brings forward power sector decarbonisation even earlier. So the challenge is there, and I suppose the barrier is to getting the level of deployment and getting the acceptability within communities. We can't do the transition quicker than communities will allow or will consent to. So, that will be a challenge. I think Northern Ireland, we've had very high success rates in terms of planning approvals to date, and I think I suppose to some extent the community opposition to wind has come a bit later, but I think it is starting to mobilise now. So, we as a sector need to look at how we work together with communities and ensure, Andy used the term earlier, just transition, to ensure it is a just transition, and we play our part in ensuring that the communities see the benefit of the investment in renewables, which we are convinced are there and can evidence, but it's not sometimes. It's maybe not to go back into Brexit, but as we've seen with the Brexit debate, story sometimes overtakes truth, and we need to make sure that the story matches the truth, and we do tell that story of the benefits of renewables.
Yeah, could you see a future for Northern Ireland where there'd be net negative from biomass with carbon capture and storage? Is that a likelihood, or would it be something else, do you think?
I think, we actually interestingly have a forestry sector that's currently a net contributor in terms of greenhouse gases. So we buck the trend in that in a very negative way. In terms of carbon capture and storage, I think from the assessments I've seen, Northern Ireland, the type of scale, Northern Ireland isn't really seen as viable for carbon capture and storage. So, it's back to the power sector to do that. We have got a large agriculture sector, and biomass is starting to grow in terms of proportion of renewable generation, but I think it's fair to say that it's still in a controversial space at the minute. So it'll be interesting to see how the energy strategy lands in terms of biomass, how much it seeks to promote it.
Okay, and then just in turn, coming back to this question on state support in general, Andy, I don't know. If you could say a few words on this question of power markets and the equilibrium one can see where because of the cannibalization of revenues, that actually it's difficult to push on targets without state support. How do you see that? Do you imagine there'll be an endless stream of state support?
So I think there's always going to need to be recognition that even with a desire to move beyond maybe some of the direct subsidies that we saw earlier in the transition, a desire for more merchant and or direct consumer offtake supported projects to go ahead. All of those merchant type projects will always face a policy risk or a policy related risk on revenue from further interventions, and by their nature then that's likely to require some form of mechanism to protect against that, to allow this to happen. The kind of CFD arrangements that we have are generally being designed to provide a facilitating support, ideally at a level which maybe doesn't involve an extra amount of subsidy, but ignoring it and hoping that the kind of merchant developers will always be able to face that risk, even with an ever increasing amount of installed capacity, I think is unlikely. So, given the importance of policy in its impacts on the market, I think there's always likely to be some form of mechanism, recognizing and insuring against or insulating against that to some degree. There are real challenges of what electricity systems look like with very high level of renewables, and the Irish market is a great forerunner of this. Stephen mentioned earlier the kind of levels of renewables that we're seeing in Northern Ireland and the Republic, and those exceeds the level that are seen in most markets, and that's in a market which is relatively small and relatively less well interconnected with a whole bunch of other markets as well. And so the challenges of managing systems with that level of intermittent renewables are being seen and are being addressed in the Irish market, both in the Republic and in Northern Ireland. And that's those experiences, those challenges are going to continue. They're going to become harder, but it does mean that the Irish market is really having to pick up and deal with those challenges much sooner than many other places, and will bring lessons to be taken elsewhere as a result.
Yeah, and for my own thinking, I can imagine the situation would only change in terms of state support, perhaps in a world where we've managed to engage the demand, the customer side fully, and really made use of all the flexible demand that's available. And I'm thinking here about the future, especially with heat and transport, which will be fairly large parts of the electricity demand of the future. Without that, it does seem somewhat difficult. So then, finally, Stephen, coming back to you, if we wanted to put it succinctly, what really needs to happen in Northern Ireland in the next, 1, 2, 3 years to give us the best chance of hitting 2030 targets with 70, 80%?
Yeah, so we need the energy to come forward on schedule. It's scheduled for November 2021, and that can't slip any further. And then with that, we'll have the target set. We need the market mechanism to come in behind that. We need grid investment to follow. We're currently at 65% SNSP, so 65% of renewables can be accommodated at any one time. There's plans for that to go up to 75% by the end of 2021. It needs to be at 95% by 2030. And then what we really need is a facilitative planning regime, because at the minute we have a Department for Economy that's pushing for more renewables, but a planning system that's resisting more renewables. So we need all levels of government to work together, and I think that joined up governance piece will be key, and that really needs to be resolved over the next, certainly in that time frame, within the next year or two.
Excellent. Well, I think there we have it. How we can move forward with renewables in Northern Ireland. I would just really like to thank you, Stephen, for your time today and for your insights, and also Andy. So thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And this is Fueling the Transition from AFRY Management Consulting. Please do subscribe through your usual channels, and thank you very much for listening.